The fire didn't spread slowly. It erupted, a wall of orange and black that swallowed the east corridor of the Harwick Grand in under 4 minutes, and Dara Osei was still inside it. Nora Selby felt the heat before she heard the alarms. She was on her knees in the service corridor of the 14th floor, regrouting the cracked tile along the baseboard. Overtime she had volunteered for because $43 an hour was $43 she desperately needed when the smell hit her. Not smoke, exactly. Something chemical underneath it. Accelerant. She had grown up in a house that burned down once, when she was 9, and the body never forgets that particular smell. She was on her feet before the sprinklers activated. The Harwick Grand Hotel occupied a full city block in downtown Vancouver, a heritage building that had stood since 1923 and had been meticulously, expensively restored by its current owner into one of the most exclusive private venues in British Columbia. Nora had worked here for 11 months as a maintenance technician, a title that meant she fixed everything from leaking pipes to broken chandeliers without complaint and without overtime pay when the union wasn't looking. She knew the building the way a surgeon knows a body, every artery and nerve, every secret passage, which was why she knew, the moment she stepped into the east corridor and saw the smoke billowing from the seam of Suite 1408's door, that the fire escape nearest to her was already compromised. The ventilation shaft above it connected directly to the burning room. She also knew that Suite 1408 had been booked under a corporate alias, Terracana Holdings, for the past 3 days. She knew because the head of maintenance, Derek Finch, had pulled her aside on Tuesday and told her, with a look that communicated more than words, that she was not to clean, service, or enter that suite under any circumstances. Whatever was being discussed inside was not her business. Nora had understood immediately. The Harwick Grand had a second clientele that never appeared on the official registry. She turned to run back toward the service stairs. That was when she heard it. Not an alarm, not the sprinklers. A cough. Low, labored, and coming from inside 1408. Nora stopped. She stood in the corridor for exactly 4 seconds, the heat pressing against her face like an open oven, the smoke thickening around her ankles. She thought about her younger brother, Elliot, 19 years old, and currently on a ventilator in a room at Vancouver General, waiting for a lung transplant that their family could not begin to afford. She thought about the specialist's invoice sitting on her kitchen table, $11,200 due by the end of the month, or Elliot lost his place on the private priority list and went back to the public queue, which had a wait time of 18 months. She thought about how the money she made at this hotel was the only thread keeping him tethered to a fighting chance. She thought about all of this, and then she pulled her work apron up over her mouth and nose and kicked the door of Suite 1408 open. The room was chaos and heat and dark, rolling smoke. The fire had originated from the far corner, near the wet bar. The curtains were gone, the wall was actively burning, and the thick plaster was beginning to crack and blister. The sprinklers were doing almost nothing. A private security system, installed separately from the building's standard one, had shorted out entirely, its small red indicator light blinking uselessly on the wall. On the floor, half collapsed against the foot of the king bed, was a man. He was large, broad through the shoulders, dressed in what had been an expensive white dress shirt, now drenched with both sweat and blood. His right hand was pressed against his ribs, and even through the smoke Nora could see the dark stain spreading between his fingers. He had not been caught in the fire. He had already been wounded when the fire started. His face, in the brief flash of orange light, was striking in the cold, severe way of someone who had never once been told no and who had arranged his entire life to ensure that remained true. He was perhaps 40. Dark hair, jaw set against pain he clearly refused to acknowledge out loud. His eyes found her immediately, focused, alert, not the eyes of a man who was losing. "Get out," he said. His voice was completely flat. Not a warning, a dismissal, as though she were an interruption in a meeting. "The ceiling is going to come down in about 3 minutes, Nora said, crouching beside him, her hands already assessing. "Can you walk?" I said. Can you walk?" she repeated, louder, because the fire was louder and she did not have time for his pride. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, recalibration. "Not fast," he admitted, "fast enough." She got her shoulder under his arm, and he was heavy in the specific solid way of a man with no spare weight anywhere on his body, and for a moment when he tried to push himself upright, he made a sound that he immediately tried to suppress, a short, involuntary hiss of pain that told Nora the rib wound was worse than it looked. "Hold pressure on that," she ordered. "Don't move your hand. I know how a wound works," he said. "Great, then walk." She dragged him toward the door. Not the main corridor, that was already too far gone. Nora turned left instead toward the linen service door at the far end that connected to a secondary maintenance shaft she used every week to access the building's HVAC system. Guests never knew it existed. The smoke was thinner here, the heat more bearable. She shouldered the door open and pulled him through. The shaft was narrow and dark, the emergency strip lighting casting everything in pale. She moved them fast, one hand on his arm, one on the wall, navigating from pure muscle, memory. He kept up, barely, but he kept up, which meant he was either extraordinarily determined or operating on a level of adrenaline that was going to crash hard the moment the danger passed. "Where are we going?" he said, between controlled breaths. "Loading dock on the north side. My truck is parked there." A pause. "Why your truck?" "Because the fire department is going to evacuate this building in the next 60 seconds, and the lobby is going to be full of people with cameras." She glanced sideways at him. "And I don't think you want to be photographed." He said nothing, which was confirmation enough. The loading dock was cold and dark and smelled of diesel and wet concrete. The smell of the real underside of any luxury building, the part the guests never saw. Nora's truck, a 10-year-old Ranger she kept in better shape than it looked, was parked exactly where she'd left it after hauling a load of replacement tiles that afternoon. She got him into the passenger seat, and by the time she had the engine running, the sound of sirens was converging on the hotel's front entrance half a block away. She pulled out through the service alley without headlights. Neither of them spoke for 2 full minutes. Nora drove east, away from the lights, her hands steady on the wheel. She was running on the same cold, focused adrenaline she'd operated on the night Elliot was rushed to emergency. The kind that didn't allow for panic, only for sequence. "What is the next necessary thing?" "Do that, then the next." "You're bleeding through your shirt," she said. "I'm aware. I have a first aid kit in the back. It's not going to be enough for what you've got, but it'll slow it down." "Drive east on Terminal," he said. "There's a private clinic on Boundary Road. They'll be expecting me." Nora raised an eyebrow. "Expecting you? My team would have been alerted the moment the fire started." A pause. "The people who started it were not trying to burn the building. They were trying to flush me out. They knew the fire would force me to move, and they would be watching the exits." Nora kept her eyes on the road. Her hands tightened on the wheel, exactly once. "So they might have seen us leave. Possibly would they have recognized me?" The man turned his head to look at her directly. In the ambient light of the passing street lamps, his eyes were dark gray, and they were evaluating her with the same calm, methodical precision she suspected he applied to everything. "No," he said finally. "They didn't know there was anyone else in that room." Another pause. "I didn't know there was anyone else in that room." "Maintenance technician," Nora said. "I was working late. You shouldn't have been on that floor." "No," she agreed. "I shouldn't have." She signaled and turned onto Terminal. "What's the clinic address?" He gave it. They drove in silence for 3 more minutes. Then, "You knew not to take the main corridor," he said. "You knew that service door. I know this building better than the people who own it. And you knew not to use the lobby." "I know what you are," Nora said simply. "Or what your sweet booking means. Anyway, the building has had 4 Terracana Holdings reservations in the past 18 months. The head of maintenance gets very nervous every time, and nobody talks about it afterward." She paused. "I don't want to know your name. I don't want to know what happened in that room. I want to get you to your clinic and go home." The private clinic was a converted townhouse on a quiet block, the kind of place with frosted windows and no sign. 2 men were already outside when Nora pulled up. Dark jackets, earpieces, the posture of people paid to be invisible until they weren't. They had the passenger door open before she'd fully stopped, moving with the efficiency of people who had done this before. The man, her passenger, the wounded stranger she had pulled from a burning room. He turned back to look at her through the open door. Up close, out of the smoke and the chaos, there was something different in his expression. Not gratitude, exactly. Too controlled for that, but something that recognized a debt. "Your name," he said. It wasn't a question. "Nora Selby," she said before she could decide whether it was wise. "Building maintenance. Harwick Grand." He held her gaze for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then his men closed the door, and they were gone, and Nora sat alone in her truck outside a clinic with no sign, hands still perfectly steady on the wheel, and allowed herself, for the first time, to shake. She drove home. She did not sleep. The call came at 6:47 the following morning. Not her cell phone, the building's direct line for maintenance requests, which rang through to a small pager she kept clipped to her jacket. The message was 3 words: loading dock. Now, Nora stood in her kitchen in her work clothes, cup of tea halfway to her lips, and stared at the pager. She had been in the building for 40 minutes already. It was a Tuesday, which meant she had to be at Elliot's bedside by 8 to meet with his care team. She had exactly 1 hour. She went to the loading dock. There was a man waiting beside a black SUV she had never seen in the service lot before. Not one of the two from last night. This one was younger, with a watchful, contained quality that made her think of a border collie pretending to be calm. "Miss Selby," he said. "My name is Harlan Prest. I work for Mr. Sterling." Nora said nothing, because she still didn't know his name and she understood now that she was about to. "Gideon Sterling?" Harlan said, answering the question she hadn't asked. "He'd like to speak with you this morning, if you're available." "I have somewhere to be at 8. This won't take long." A pause. "He asked me to mention that he's aware your brother is at VGH. He'd like to discuss that as well." The words landed with precise, deliberate weight. Nora felt it. The specific nausea of understanding that someone had already looked into your life and found all the things you were most afraid to lose. "Tell me something," Nora said, her voice flat. "Is this a request, or is it the kind of request I don't get to say no to?" Harlan Prest had the decency to hold her gaze. "Mr. Sterling prefers to call it an invitation. He's not someone who needs to force things. That's not an answer." "No," Harlan admitted. "It isn't." He opened the rear door of the SUV. "But he did ask me to tell you that you'd be back in time for your 8 o'clock. Gideon Sterling was in a suite on the top floor of a different hotel, the kind of anonymous corporate tower near the airport that business travelers use specifically because it has no character and no one looks twice at anyone. He was sitting at a desk by the window when Harlan brought her in, his right side bound under a pressed dark shirt, moving carefully in the way of someone who had taken pain medication for the first time in years and was annoyed by its effects. He looked in daylight, exactly like what he was. Nora had spent 11 months working inside a building that hosted men like this, and she had learned to read the particular way power wore itself. Not in the clothes or the hotels, but in the stillness. The way people like Gideon Sterling occupied space, as though they had already decided how everything in the room would proceed. "Mrs. Selby," he said, "please sit." He assessed this, and then he nodded, once in the way of a man who respected efficiency. "I owe you my life," he said, "not as a sentiment, as an accounting." "You don't owe me anything," Nora said. "I did what anyone would have done. You did what very few people would have done, and you did it better than most trained professionals could have. You knew the building. You knew not to use the exits they would be watching. You knew when to stop asking questions and start moving." He paused. "I've been doing what I do for a long time, Miss Selby, and I know the difference between someone who acted on instinct and someone who acted on competence." "Your brother," Gideon continued. "Elliot James Selby, 19. Idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, currently awaiting a bilateral lung transplant at Vancouver General. Private priority placement requires a monthly retainer that represents approximately 60% of your after-tax income from the Harwick Grand, not including the personal loan you took against your car last spring." Nora kept her face still. This was the part where she was supposed to feel afraid, or angry, or grateful. She felt none of those things yet. She felt the way she always felt when she was inside a problem with no clear exit. Steady, and very cold, and entirely focused. "What do you want?" she said. Gideon Sterling looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He told her the truth. The people who set that fire last night were working for a man named Corrigan Holt. He controls 3 port operations along the BC coast, and he has been systematically dismantling the distribution agreements my family has held in this region for 30 years. He said this the way a professor might explain a structural problem in a building, with precision and without apology. "Last night was an attempt to remove me as an obstacle. They failed, but they will try again, and the next attempt will be more direct." "This still isn't telling me what you want from me," Nora said. "I need to relocate to a secure property north of the city for the next 3 to 4 weeks while my people dismantle Corrigan Holt's operation. The property is remote, a private lodge on a lake north of Whistler. It's off the grid, off every database Holt's people have access to." He paused. "The wound in my side nicked the lower lobe of my right lung. The clinic stabilized it, but I can't be moved by medical transport without creating a record. I need someone who knows how to manage a medical situation, who can drive me there tonight without using any route that appears on a standard GPS, and who has a reason to stay quiet about all of it." Nora looked at him. "You want me to be your escort nurse and driver. I want someone who already pulled me out of a fire and had the sense not to ask questions she didn't need answered," Gideon said. "The medical side is manageable. My clinic doctor will brief you fully, and a surgical team will be at the lodge within 24 hours to complete the repair. The drive is 4 hours on back roads. And the quiet." He stopped. "The quiet I am prepared to compensate you for significantly." He slid a folder across the desk. Nora didn't touch it. "Open it," Gideon said. She opened it. The top sheet was a letter from Vancouver General's Transplant Coordination Office, dated that morning, informing Elliot James Selby that his priority placement had been confirmed and fully funded through the Sterling Medical Foundation for a period of 2 years. The second sheet was a summary of a lung transplant surgery scheduled for the following Thursday. A matching donor had been identified overnight. Nora set the folder back on the desk. Her hands were completely still. "You did this before you knew whether I'd say yes," she said. "Yes? Why?" Gideon Sterling looked at her. "Because you pulled me out of a burning room when you didn't have to, and because I do not like being in debt to people, and because that," he nodded at the folder, "was the right thing to do regardless of what you decide." Nora was quiet for a long time. Through the window, she could see the mountains north of the city, white-capped and enormous, indifferent to the specific human calculus happening in this room. 4 hours north on back roads, she said. "Yes, remote lodge. I manage the wound until your surgical team arrives, 24 hours at most, and then what? I come home and forget this happened?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "That depends," he said, "on what Corrigan Holt decides to do next." They drove north that evening as the light failed. Nora at the wheel of a Range Rover that Harlan had sourced through means she didn't ask about. Gideon Sterling in the back seat with a portable oxygen monitor clipped to his finger and his eyes mostly closed. He was not unconscious. She could tell because every time her route deviated from what she assumed his mental map expected, he would open his eyes briefly and then close them again when he confirmed she was doing it correctly. He didn't ask how she knew the roads. She had spent 2 summers in her early 20s doing trail maintenance in the mountains north of Pemberton. She knew every logging road and forestry detour between Vancouver and the lodge address Harlan had given her, and she used all of them. They did not speak much. She checked his oxygen levels at each stop. The numbers held. At one point, somewhere north of Squamish, when the road narrowed to a single lane, and the pines pressed close on both sides, he said, without opening his eyes, "You dropped out of engineering." Nora kept her eyes on the road. "How do you know that?" "You navigate like an engineer. You assessed the structural situation in that hotel room before you moved. You saw the ventilation shaft problem before you smelled the smoke properly." A pause. "And your personnel file at the Harwick has a note that your certificate is in civil engineering, not trades. I had 2 years of a degree," she said. "Elliot got sick. I needed income immediately, not 4 more years of school." She paused. "Maintenance pays well if you're good at it. You're more than good at it." She said nothing. "That wasn't meant as a compliment," Gideon said. "It was meant as an observation. You are operating significantly below your capacity." "Most people are," Nora said, and the conversation ended there, because the turnoff for the lodge appeared in her headlights, and she needed both hands and all her attention on the mud-slicked track through the trees. The lodge was not what she had expected. She had assumed something military, bare and functional, built for security rather than anything else. Instead, it was a large, low building of cedar and glass, set back from the lakeshore surrounded by mature spruce and Douglas fir. It was beautiful in the way that expensive things sometimes accidentally were. It also had, she noted as she did a slow exterior assessment, in the dark 6 external cameras, reinforced doors and window glazing that had a particular sheen she recognized from the Harwick's VIP suites. Bulletproof glass. This was a building built to last a siege. Inside, a small team was already in place. A doctor who introduced himself only as the clinic physician, 2 security personnel, and a woman named Petra who appeared to be Gideon's personal assistant and who looked at Nora with an expression that communicated, professionally and completely, that she was not yet trusted. Nora was fine with that. She spent the first night in a small room off the main corridor, door unlocked, window overlooking the lake. She did not easily. Through the wall she could hear the low murmur of the doctor moving around Gideon's suite, the occasional soft tone of monitoring equipment, the sound of a man managing a serious injury with characteristic silence. At 3 in the morning, she heard a sharp, short sound that wasn't a monitor. She was out of bed and in the corridor before she had fully woken up. Gideon was upright in the chair by the window, not collapsed, not in distress, but breathing in the deliberate, controlled way of someone managing escalating pain without medication, and the monitoring lead had slipped from his wrist. The alarm had been him silencing it, not a medical event. He looked at her in the doorway with the expression of a man who did not enjoy being caught being human. "The doctor is asleep," she said. "I'm aware. Do you want me to wake him?" "No." A pause. "I don't need the medication. It slows my thinking." Nora came into the room. She picked up the monitoring lead, sat in the chair across from him, and reattached it without asking. She read the numbers. They were stable. "The surgical team arrives at 9, she said. "I know. Then think slowly until morning and don't pull that lead off again," she said. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile. More the shadow of one, present and then gone. "You give orders like someone who outranks me," he said. "In this room at 3 in the morning managing your vitals, I do outrank you." She settled back in the chair. "Go to sleep." She hadn't expected him to, but he sat quietly, and she sat across from him, and the lake outside the window went from black to grey to the pale silver of a northern dawn. And somewhere in those hours, the specific charged silence between a man who was accustomed to controlling everything and a woman who had learned to operate inside impossible situations began to feel less like guarded territory and more like something else. Something she didn't name. At 7, she made coffee. At 8:45, the surgical team arrived by float plane on the lake, and Nora stepped back entirely and let them work. She stood on the porch in the cold, damp morning air, and she breathed, and she thought about Elliot, and she thought about the folder she had left on the desk in that anonymous hotel suite, the letter, the surgery date, the future she had been fighting for in increments of $43 an hour. The surgery was 4 hours. The surgeon came out and told her, not Harlan, not Petra, but her, that it had gone cleanly and that Mr. Sterling would be on restricted activity for 2 weeks, but would have full recovery. She realized, standing on the porch with the lake behind her and the mountains above her, that she had been unconsciously holding her breath for approximately 20 hours. She let it out. It was Petra who came to her that evening, with an envelope and a prepared expression. "Mr. Sterling asked me to give you this," she said, "and to tell you that a car will take you back to Vancouver in the morning." Nora took the envelope. Inside was a card, thick cream stock, his name embossed at the top, with a handwritten note in controlled, angular script. "Your obligation ended when we reached the lodge. Everything after that was your choice. I don't forget choices like that. GS." Beneath the card was a check that represented what she calculated to be roughly 4 months of her salary. She stood in the corridor looking at both of these for a long time. Then she walked back to Gideon's room. He was awake, propped up against the headboard, a tablet in his left hand, his right side still heavily bandaged. He looked like a man who had been through significant trauma and was irritated by the inconvenience. He looked, she thought, like himself. He looked up when she came in. "The car is arranged for," he started. "I know what you're trying to do," Nora said. He stopped. "You're settling the account," she said. "The brother's surgery was the life debt. The check is for the lodge. Everything is itemized and paid, and I go home and we are strangers with a shared secret who will never be a problem for each other." She paused. "That's the offer." Gideon looked at her. "It's a fair offer." "It is," she agreed. "It's also the kind of offer that tells me you're afraid I'm a loose end." "You're not a loose end. Then why does the offer feel like one?" She pulled the card and the check out of the envelope and set them on the bedside table. "Corrigan Holt still doesn't know who drove you out of Vancouver. He still doesn't know this location. And from what Harlan let slip this morning when he thought I was out of earshot, his people are still looking." Gideon's expression did not change. "That situation is being managed. By how many people who don't know this building the way I know the Harwick?" She held his gaze. "I am an engineer who has spent 2 years learning to see every building I enter as a system. I know which doors fail first, which routes are invisible, which structural points are vulnerabilities, and which ones are assets." She paused. "I'm not proposing anything. I'm telling you what I bring that you don't already have." The silence in the room was complete, except for the sound of the lake outside, water moving against the dock in small, patient increments. "This isn't a life you should want," Gideon said, finally. "I know that." She met his eyes. "I also know what the life I had was. And I know what I'm capable of, which is something I haven't had a use for in 2 years." A pause. "Let me stay through the 2 weeks. After that, if Holt is neutralized and the threat is gone, I'll take the car and the check and we'll be strangers." Gideon Sterling looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he was weighing, he weighed it carefully. She had already learned that everything he did was careful. 2 weeks, he said finally. It was not the 2 weeks that changed everything. It was day 9. Nora was reviewing the lodge's exterior camera system when she noticed something. The footage was motion-triggered, automatically logging every sweep of the perimeter. She had been methodically reviewing the archived logs, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she had been thinking for 3 days about the specific way the fire at the Harwick had started. Chemical accelerant, rapid spread, precise origin point. And it had reminded her of something a structural engineering professor had told her once about how the most sophisticated attacks always targeted the thing the building trusted most. The Harwick's sprinkler system had been tampered with, not disabled, modified. The suppressant pressure had been reduced on the 14th floor, specifically ensuring the fire would build faster than standard suppression could handle, while still appearing operational. It was a subtle technical alteration that no one would look for, because the system had never fully failed. It had just failed where it mattered. She had been thinking about what that level of precision implied about Corrigan Holt's people. She had been thinking about the Lodge's own systems. On the archived footage from Day 3, just before sunrise, she found it. A single frame, motion-triggered, then stilled, of a person at the edge of the tree line 300 meters north of the property. They had not crossed the perimeter. They had only looked. She brought it to Harlan first. That could be a hiker, Harlan said, studying the frame. Whistler hikers don't carry that silhouette, Nora said, pointing to the barely visible rectangular profile at the figure's left hip. That's a long-range communications unit, not a camera or a walking pole. She pulled up the timestamp, and they arrived 17 minutes before the floatplane, which means they were watching for air traffic, not hiking. Harlan looked at the image for a long time. Mr. Sterling needs to see this, he said. The conversation that followed in Gideon's room lasted 40 minutes and included Harlan, the head of the security team, and Nora, who had not been invited to these conversations before and was aware, sitting on the edge of the room, that the invitation itself meant something had shifted. Gideon listened to everything without interrupting. Then he looked at Nora. How many access points does this building have that are not on the official architectural plan? He said. Nora had already walked the building 3 times since she arrived. She had also pulled the original 1987 construction records from a provincial database on her laptop because the cedar paneling in the northwest corner of the main room had a specific resonance when she walked past it that told her there was a hollow space behind it. 2, she said. A crawl space access beneath the utility room that connects to the storm drainage channel at the north side of the property, and a partial sub-floor passage under the original foundation that exits about 40 meters into the tree line, east side, not north. Silence in the room. You found those in 9 days, Gideon said. I found them in the first 2, Nora said. I spent the last 7 figuring out which one Holt's people would find first. She watched him process this. She watched him recalibrate, the way he had recalibrated in the burning corridor when he had stopped arguing with her and started moving. She was learning to read him the way she read buildings, the structural logic underneath the surface. The north drainage access, he said. Yes, she said. So we use the east passage. If we need to move, yes. But I think the better play is this. She had a diagram on her laptop, drawn in the building's notes application because she hadn't asked for anything more sophisticated. She turned it toward him. If they're planning a ground approach, they'll use the north tree line as cover. The drainage channel looks like an exit, but it's actually a kill box. Anyone moving through it has no lateral cover and is exposed for 30 meters before they reach the timber. She tapped the diagram. If your people are positioned here and here, the moment someone commits to the channel approach, they're already surrounded. Gideon Sterling looked at the diagram. He looked at Nora. You drew this from memory, he said. I'm a visual thinker, she said. The approach came at 4:17 the following morning. Nora was in the main room, awake, watching the perimeter feeds on Harlan's laptop, the lodge utterly silent around her. Gideon was in the corridor behind her, against medical advice and in defiance of what she had told him 4 times in the previous 12 hours. He was upright, dressed, and carrying himself with the specific, controlled tension of a man who would not watch his own house be breached from a bed. She had stopped arguing about it after the 3rd time. The 3 men Holt had sent made exactly the mistake she had predicted. They committed to the drainage channel because it looked like the soft approach. Gideon's security team was already in place, and the whole thing was over in 6.5 minutes. Contained, no shots fired inside the building, 2 of the 3 men detained alive. Nora watched it on the monitor and felt nothing dramatic. Just the quiet, exhausted satisfaction of a system working the way she had engineered it to work. Behind her, she heard Gideon exhale slowly. Holt will know this failed by morning, he said. Yes, he'll move to direct communication. He'll want to negotiate or threaten, not keep sending teams. Gideon paused, which means the physical threat is effectively over. Which means, Nora said, turning to face him, that my 2 weeks are almost up. He looked at her across the main room of the lodge, in the thin pre-dawn dark, the laptop still open on the table between them. He was pale from the recovery and from the night's tension, and he looked, for the first time since she had pulled him off the floor of a burning hotel suite, like a man who had arrived somewhere he hadn't expected to arrive at. The car can be arranged for whenever you want it, he said. I know. Nora was quiet. What happens to Holt? He'll be handled, Gideon said. Not a threat, a fact, stated with the same evenness he applied to everything. His agreements with the port operators are already being dissolved through means he can't trace back to me. The operation collapses without him needing to know why. And this? She gestured, a small motion that encompassed the lodge and the past 2 weeks and everything she had walked into without meaning to. This is just over. It can be, Gideon said, if that's what you want. She thought about her apartment on Commercial Drive, the engineering textbooks she kept in a box under the bed because it hurt too much to shelve them. She thought about Elliot, who would call her from VGH that morning if she could get a signal, who would be hoarse from the ventilator but who would be alive, and getting more alive every day, in a way that no longer required every dollar she had. She thought about what it had felt like to look at a building and see the problem, to draw the diagram and be right, to sit in a room full of professionals and know that she was the one who had found the thing they missed. She thought about the man across the table from her, who had told her the truth when he didn't have to, and paid the debt before he knew if she'd help him, and who had looked at the diagram on a laptop and understood it in seconds, because he was also underneath everything, someone who thought in systems. The check, she said, and the brother's surgery, those aren't conditional on anything. They never were, Gideon said. Then this is separate, Nora said, whatever happens next. He looked at her. In the growing light from the east-facing windows, the lake outside beginning to take back its color from the dark, she could see the precise moment when the accounting in him let go of something. The ledger he kept, the debts and the settlements, the measured transactions through which men like Gideon navigated a world that was always trying to take things from them. Yes, he said. Separate. Then I'm not taking the morning car, Nora said. She said it the way she had said everything else to him from the beginning, without drama, without softening it, the way you state a structural conclusion when the calculation is complete and the numbers are clear. Gideon Sterling was quiet for a long time. Outside, the lake went from silver to blue, and the first birds of the morning started up in the timber, and somewhere to the south, a city was waking up that believed Nora Selby was a maintenance technician who had never been more than she appeared to be. She had been wrong about that for a long time. She was done being wrong about it. All right, Gideon said quietly. Not a concession, a beginning. Nora had walked into a burning room because she couldn't walk away from a person who needed help, and she had come out of it changed. Not broken, not diminished, but rearranged. The woman who had folded herself into a too small life because the alternative was hope she couldn't afford had burned away in the 14th floor of the Harwick Grand, and what was left was the version of her that had always been underneath. Clear-eyed and competent, and done apologizing for knowing her own worth. She didn't become someone's partner that morning on the lake. That would take longer and be harder and have its own story. But she became, finally and entirely, someone who had chosen her own direction. Not as a maid cleaning up after other people's lives, not as a sister sacrificing everything for someone else's future, but as herself. An engineer who had learned to read the buildings that powerful men hid inside, and who had decided, with full knowledge of what that meant, to keep walking through the doors.